It is September 13th, 1848, in the small town of Cavendish, Vermont. A crew of railroad workers is preparing a blasting charge, a routine and dangerous procedure in which a hole is drilled into rock, filled with explosive powder, and tamped down with a long steel rod before detonation. The man doing the tamping is the crew's foreman. He is 25 years old, experienced, careful, and well regarded by everyone who works with him. Something goes wrong. The powder ignites prematurely. The explosion sends the tamping iron, a steel rod 3.5 feet long, over an inch in diameter, weighing more than 13 pounds, shooting upward like a cannon shell. It enters the foreman's skull, just below his left cheekbone. It passes through his brain. It exits through the top of his head. It lands, covered in blood and brain matter, more than 20 feet away. The foreman is thrown onto his back. His arms and legs convulse briefly, and then, within a few minutes, he sits up. He speaks. He is helped onto an ox cart and rides, sitting upright, into town. He walks into the doctor's office. He sits down in a chair and begins to describe what happened to him in complete sentences, while the doctor stares at the hole in his head. He survives. And this is where the story becomes something more than a survival story. Because Phineas Gage, the man who lived with a rod through his brain, did not come back from that accident unchanged. He came back different. Profoundly, permanently, disturbingly different. Different enough that the people who knew him best said, with complete seriousness, that the man who walked out of that field was not the same man who had walked into it. His body survived, but something else, something harder to name, something that lived in the part of his brain the rod had destroyed, did not. And what that something was, and what its loss revealed about the nature of the human mind, changed science forever. This is the full story of Phineas Gage. To understand what the accident took from Phineas Gage, we need to understand who he was before it happened. Phineas P. Gage was born in 1823 in Grafton County, New Hampshire. He grew up in rural New England at a time when the region was being transformed by the rapid expansion of the railroad network, one of the great infrastructure projects of the 19th century, reshaping the American landscape and the American economy simultaneously. Railroad construction in the 1840s was dangerous, physical, and demanding work. It required men who could manage complex logistics, maintain discipline over large crews, handle explosives competently, and make sound decisions quickly under pressure. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of work that separated capable people from incapable ones very quickly. Phineas Gage was exceptionally capable. By the age of 25, he had risen to the position of foreman for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad, one of the most responsible positions available to a working man on a construction crew. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person you want in that role. His employers described him as efficient and capable. His crew liked and respected him. He was energetic, reliable, and possessed of what people at the time called good sense, the practical intelligence that allows a person to navigate complex situations with good judgment. He was also, by the accounts that survive, a pleasant person to be around. Not in a superficial way, not merely polite or agreeable, but genuinely well-liked. He had friends. He was trusted. He was the kind of man who, in the language of the era, had good character. This characterization matters enormously. It is not hagiography applied after the fact to make the story more dramatic. It comes from contemporary accounts, from his employer's records, from the recollections of people who knew him. Before September 13th, 1848, Phineas Gage was a young man with a good future ahead of him, someone whose competence and character had already distinguished him from his peers. The work he was doing on the day of the accident was the construction of a railroad line through Cavendish, Vermont. The terrain required blasting, the removal of rock through controlled explosions to create a level path for the tracks. Gage and his crew had been doing this work for some time. It was routine for them, in the way that any repeatedly performed dangerous task becomes routine for experienced workers. The procedure for blasting was specific. First, a hole was drilled into the rock. Then explosive powder was poured in. Then sand was poured on top of the powder to contain and direct the force of the explosion. Then the whole charge was tamped down, compacted firmly, using a long iron rod, so that the explosion would direct its force into the rock rather than blowing back out of the hole. The tamping iron was a custom tool made to Gage's own specifications, 3 feet 7 inches long, 1¼ inches in diameter at its widest point, tapering to 1/4 inch at the pointed end, weighing 13¼ pounds. It was a serious piece of metal, heavy and solid, made for a specific purpose. Gage had used it hundreds of times without incident. On September 13, 1848, something went wrong with the sequence. The exact cause has been debated. Did he forget to add the sand? Did someone distract him at the wrong moment? Did the rock produce a spark when the iron touched it? But the result was not in question. The powder ignited before it should have, and the tamping iron became a projectile. The physics of what happened to Phineas Gage on that September afternoon have been analyzed in remarkable detail by scientists and engineers in the decades since, partly out of genuine scientific interest, and partly because the specific trajectory of the rod through his skull is central to understanding what brain damage he sustained, and what that damage reveals about how the brain works. The rod entered below the left zygomatic arch, the bony prominence of the left cheek. It traveled upward and slightly to the right, passing through the left side of the skull and exiting through the top of the head, just to the left of the midline. The exit wound was approximately 3½ inches in diameter. The speed of the rod at the moment of entry has been estimated, based on the explosive charge used and the physics of the blasting procedure, at somewhere between 40 and 80 feet per second. Fast enough to pass through a human skull without significantly decelerating. Fast enough that the entire transit, entry to exit, took a fraction of a second. In that fraction of a second, the rod passed through and destroyed significant portions of Phineas Gage's brain. Specifically, and this is the detail that would become central to everything that followed, it damaged the left frontal lobe, and almost certainly the connections between the frontal lobes and the deeper structures of the brain involved in emotion and decision-making. The frontal lobes sit at the front of the brain, behind the forehead. In 1848, almost nothing was known about what they did. The brain was understood, in a general sense, as the organ of the mind, but the idea that specific regions of the brain were responsible for specific mental functions was only beginning to emerge in scientific thinking. Most educated people still believed that the mind was somewhat separate from the brain, that personality, character, and will were not purely physical phenomena that could be damaged by a piece of metal. Phineas Gage was about to provide evidence that challenged this belief profoundly. But first, he was alive. This fact alone is almost incomprehensible. A 13-pound steel rod had passed completely through his skull at high velocity. The exit wound alone was large enough that observers at the scene reported being able to see brain matter. By any reasonable expectation, he should have been killed instantly, or at minimum, rendered immediately and permanently unconscious. He was not. Witnesses at the scene reported that Gage was thrown onto his back by the force of the explosion. His limbs convulsed briefly, and then, within a few minutes, he began to speak. He was helped to a position sitting against a rock. He remained conscious and communicative while his crew, stunned, frightened, uncertain what to do, organized transportation into town. He was loaded onto an ox cart, sitting upright, and driven approximately a mile into Cavendish. When the cart arrived at the hotel where he was to receive medical attention, Gage stepped down from the cart with assistance and walked into the building. He sat in a chair and waited for the doctor. The doctor who attended him was John Martin Harlow, a young physician who had recently established his practice in Cavendish. Harlow arrived to find a patient who was conscious, alert, and able to describe what had happened to him, with a wound in his skull through which Harlow could insert his index finger its full length and probe what was beneath. Harlow's account of the next hours and days is one of the foundational documents of neuroscience, not because it is particularly scientific by modern standards, but because it is so precise and so honest about both what he observed and what he did not understand. He cleaned the wound as best he could. He removed fragments of bone and brain matter. He dressed the injury and monitored Gage through the following days and weeks. The recovery was not straightforward. Gage developed serious infections, and there were periods when Harlow believed he would not survive. But Gage's constitution was, apparently, as robust as his work history suggested. By the end of 1848, roughly 3 months after the accident, Phineas Gage was, physically, largely recovered. But something was different. John Harlow, who continued to follow Gage's case after his physical recovery, documented the change in his patient with careful and troubled precision. Before the accident, as Harlow wrote, Gage had been a man of balanced temperament, energetic, persistent, shrewd, but also respectful of others, capable of deference when deference was appropriate, and consistent in his behavior in a way that made him trustworthy and effective. After the accident, Harlow wrote, Gage was, and this passage has been quoted in neuroscience literature for over a century, fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operation which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned. In plain language, the man who had been reliable was now unreliable. The man who had been respectful was now profane and dismissive. The man who had been a capable planner was now unable to follow through on anything he started. The man who had been socially skilled, who had understood, intuitively, how to manage relationships and navigate social situations, was now oblivious to the effect of his behavior on others. His employers at the railroad tried to take him back. They could not keep him. The man who had been their best foreman was no longer capable of doing the job, not because of physical limitations, but because of the behavioral and personality changes that made him unreliable, unpredictable, and difficult to work with. His friends said, in words that have been repeated ever since, he is no longer Gage. Think about what this means for a moment. His body was Gage's body. His face, though scarred and with one eye blinded by the rod's passage, was recognizably Gage's face. His memories were intact. He knew who he was, who his family was, what his life had been. He could speak, reason, calculate. His intelligence, in the narrow sense, appeared to be largely unaffected. But his personality, the collection of traits, tendencies, values, and behavioral patterns that made him the specific person his friends and employers had known, was gone. Or rather, transformed into something his friends did not recognize as the same person. The question this raises is one of the deepest in all of philosophy and neuroscience. If the personality changes completely, does the person remain the same? If what makes you you is not your memories or your intelligence but your characteristic ways of relating to the world, your patience, your reliability, your social grace, and those things are destroyed by physical damage to your brain, what remains? His friends answered the question practically. What remained was not Gage. The science was beginning to offer a different kind of answer, a physical one. The case of Phineas Gage arrived at a pivotal moment in the history of brain science. In the mid-19th century, the dominant view of the brain among scientists was still relatively crude. It was understood that the brain was the organ of the mind, that damage to the brain produced mental effects. But the idea that the brain was organized into regions with specific functions, that this part does this, that part does that, was controversial and contested. There was a pseudoscientific movement called phrenology, which held that the shape of the skull reflected the organization of the brain beneath, and that you could read a person's character, intelligence, and temperament by feeling the bumps on their head. Phrenology was popular and wrong, but it represented a genuine public interest in the question of how the brain produces the mind. The legitimate science of brain localization, the real study of which brain regions are responsible for which functions, was only just beginning. Pierre-Paul Broca, the French physician who would identify the region of the brain responsible for speech production, did his landmark work in 1861, 13 years after Gage's accident. The field was nascent. Into this context, the Gage case arrived like a thunderclap. Here was a man who had sustained specific, locatable damage to a specific region of the brain, the frontal lobe, and had experienced specific, observable changes in personality and social behavior as a result. The damage was physical. The effects were behavioral and psychological. The connection between the two was direct and undeniable. John Harlow published his account of the case in 1848, and again in a more detailed follow-up paper in 1868, 20 years after the accident, by which point Gage had died, and Harlow had been able to examine his skull directly. The 1868 paper is the foundational document of the case, providing the detailed account of Gage's behavioral changes that became so important to subsequent scientific thinking. But the impact of the Gage case on neuroscience was not immediate. It took time for the scientific community to absorb what the case implied. Through the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th, it was referenced and discussed, but it remained somewhat peripheral to the main currents of brain research, which were focused more on sensory and motor functions than on personality and social behavior. The case was revived with extraordinary force in the 1990s by a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio. Damasio, a Portuguese-American neurologist working at the University of Iowa, was studying patients with damage to the frontal lobe, patients who had suffered strokes, tumors, or injuries that affected the same region of the brain that Gage's accident had destroyed. And he was observing in these patients something that reminded him strongly of what Harlow had described in Gage. His patients with frontal lobe damage were often intellectually intact. Their memories worked. Their language was fine. Their reasoning, when tested in abstract ways, appeared normal, but their behavior in the real world was profoundly impaired. They made terrible decisions. They could not maintain relationships. They were unable to function in social environments that required the ongoing navigation of other people's feelings and expectations. And crucially, they seemed to lack something that Damasio began to identify as emotional guidance. They could reason about situations, but they could not feel their way through them in the way that normal social functioning requires. Damasio developed this observation into a landmark theory that he called the somatic marker hypothesis, the idea that emotion is not separate from reason, but is, in fact, essential to it. that when we make decisions, we do not simply calculate the rational outcome. We draw on emotional signals, bodily feelings that guide us toward or away from certain choices. The frontal lobe, in his model, is the region where these emotional signals are integrated with rational thought to produce functional decision-making. When the frontal lobe is damaged, this integration breaks down. The person can reason but cannot feel the reasons. They can think about consequences but cannot feel them as reasons to act or not act. The result is exactly what Harlow described in Gage, a person who can plan but cannot follow through, who knows the social rules but cannot feel why they matter, who appears intelligent but makes disastrous choices. In 1994, Damasio and his colleagues, including his wife, the neuroscientist Hannah Damasio, used computer reconstruction techniques to analyze Gage's skull and determine, as precisely as possible, exactly which brain regions the rod had damaged. Their analysis confirmed that the primary damage was to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region of the frontal lobe that, in Damasio's model, is central to the integration of emotion and decision-making. The case that Harlow had documented in 1848 was 146 years later, providing specific evidence for a specific theory about how the brain produces the behaviors we associate with personality, social skill, and moral judgment. Gage's skull and the tamping iron are preserved at the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School. They have been studied, scanned, and analyzed multiple times since Damasio's landmark work, each time yielding additional insight into the specific nature and extent of the damage. What happened to Phineas Gage after the accident is a story that has taken decades of historical research to piece together. Because the historical record is fragmentary, and because, for much of the 20th century, the standard account of his post-accident life was significantly inaccurate. The traditional version of the story, the one told in textbooks for generations, has Gage descending into a life of degradation and instability, drifting from job to job, becoming a sideshow exhibit, and dying in poverty and obscurity. This version served the narrative of the story well. The bright young man destroyed by a rod through his brain, unable to function in the world, a cautionary tale about the physical basis of personality. The reality, as reconstructed by the historian Malcolm Macmillan in his exhaustive 2000 study An Odd Kind of Fame, is more complicated and in some ways more interesting. After his recovery, Gage did indeed lose his railroad job. The behavioral changes made him unsuitable for the foreman role he had held. He spent some time in New England, where he reportedly exhibited himself and his tamping iron at Barnum's American Museum in New York and at various locations around New England. This was not as degrading as it sounds in modern terms. Exhibition of curiosities, including people with unusual medical histories, was a legitimate form of entertainment and public education in the mid-19th century, and Gage appears to have participated in it voluntarily and on his own terms. More significantly, Gage eventually made his way to Chile, where he worked for approximately 7 years, from around 1852 to 1859, as a stagecoach driver in Valparaiso. This is a detail that the standard textbook account almost entirely omits, and it is extremely important. Driving a stagecoach in mid-19th century Chile was a demanding job. It required managing horses, maintaining schedules, handling passengers, navigating complex terrain, and performing the ongoing social and practical tasks of a working professional. It was not the job of a person who was completely unable to function. Macmillan's research suggests that Gage may have adapted to his new personality to a greater degree than the traditional account implies, that with time and changed circumstances, He found a context in which his altered self could function productively. The frontal lobe damage had changed him, but it had not destroyed him entirely. He was a different person, but he was a person who could work and function and manage a life, at least in some circumstances. This nuance matters enormously for the scientific story, and we will return to it. In 1859, Gage returned to the United States, specifically to San Francisco, where his mother and sister were living. His health, which had been generally good since his recovery, began to decline. He began having epileptic seizures, almost certainly a delayed consequence of the brain damage from the accident. The seizures became increasingly frequent. On May 21, 1860, 11 years, 8 months, and 8 days after the tamping iron passed through his brain, Phineas Gage died of status epilepticus, a prolonged epileptic seizure, in San Francisco. He was 36 years old. His body was buried in San Francisco. Years later, his mother agreed to have his skull exhumed and donated to science, along with the tamping iron. Both have been at Harvard ever since. He was 36 years old when he died, having survived, for nearly 12 years, an injury that should have killed him in the first minute. The story of Phineas Gage is one of the most cited cases in the history of neuroscience. It appears in virtually every introductory psychology and neuroscience textbook. It is used consistently as the foundational example of frontal lobe function and the physical basis of personality. But the story, as it is typically told, has significant problems, and being honest about those problems makes the case more interesting, not less. The first problem is the reliability of the behavioral accounts. The description of Gage's post-accident personality, the profanity, the unreliability, the social dysfunction, comes primarily from Harlow's 1868 paper, written 20 years after the fact. Harlow was a careful observer, but he was working from memory and from the accounts of others, in an era when the standards for medical case documentation were very different from today's. We do not have independent contemporary accounts of Gage's post-accident behavior from multiple sources. We have Harlow's account, and we have a few scattered references in other sources. The picture of Gage as comprehensively and permanently changed is based on a relatively thin evidentiary foundation. The second problem is the Chile complication. If Gage spent 7 years successfully driving stagecoaches in Chile, a job requiring sustained attention, social skill, and practical competence, then the traditional picture of him as permanently and totally behaviorally impaired is incomplete. Either the accounts of his impairment were exaggerated, or he experienced significant recovery over time, or the impairment was more context-dependent than the standard account suggests. Neuroscientist Macmillan argues for the third possibility, that the frontal lobe damage made Gage less capable in some contexts than in others, and that the stagecoach work in Chile was, for reasons of its routine and structure, more compatible with his altered capacities than the socially complex foreman role had been. This is actually consistent with modern understanding of frontal lobe function. Damage to the frontal lobe does not produce uniform impairment across all situations. It tends to impair the flexible, social, emotionally guided behaviors that are required in complex interpersonal situations, while leaving more routine, structured behaviors relatively intact. The third problem is the question of what exactly was damaged. The computer reconstructions of Gage's injury, both Damasio's 1994 analysis and a more recent 2012 analysis by Van Horn and colleagues, which used diffusion tensor imaging to model the white matter connections that the rod would have damaged, have produced somewhat different results. The 2012 study suggested that the damage to white matter connections was more extensive than previously believed, affecting not just the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but a broader network of frontal lobe connectivity. This does not undermine the basic picture, it refines it. The science of Gage's case has become more precise as the tools for studying it have improved, not less reliable. But the honest acknowledgement of these complications is important. The case of Phineas Gage is not a simple, clean demonstration of a simple, clean principle. It is a complex, fragmentarily documented, endlessly analyzed case that has been used, sometimes oversimplified, to support important but nuanced conclusions about brain function. The conclusions are still valid. They are just less neat than the textbook version implies. The case of Phineas Gage has been important to neuroscience for a specific scientific reason. It provided early evidence that the frontal lobe is involved in personality, social behavior, and decision-making. That evidence has been confirmed, refined, and extended by a century and a half of subsequent research. It was right, even if the original documentation was incomplete. But the case has a broader importance that goes beyond the specific science. It raises questions that are not purely scientific, questions about the nature of the self, about personal identity, about what we mean when we say that someone is the same person over time. Phineas Gage's friends said he was no longer Gage. They meant something specific by this. They did not mean that his body had changed, or that his memories had been erased, or that he had forgotten who he was. They meant that the person they had known, the person defined by his characteristic ways of being in the world, his reliability, his social warmth, his good judgment, was gone. What remained was someone they did not recognize as the same person. This is a philosophical problem of genuine depth. Most of us carry an implicit theory of personal identity, a sense of what makes us the same person from one day to the next, from one year to the next. We tend to think of the self as continuous, stable, persistent, something that survives change, that endures through time, that is the same entity whether we are 5 years old or 50. The Gage case challenges this intuition directly. If the self is not purely memories, not purely intelligence, not purely the body, if it is also, and perhaps primarily, a pattern of emotional, behavioral, and social tendencies that are physically implemented in specific brain tissue, then what happens when that tissue is destroyed? The answer that the Gage case suggests is uncomfortable. The self can be changed, not just modified at the edges but transformed at the core. The thing that his friends recognized as Phineas Gage was not an immaterial soul that transcended the physical brain. It was a pattern implemented in physical tissue. When the tissue was damaged, the pattern changed. This is not a new idea philosophically. Versions of it had been argued for centuries. But the Gage case made it concrete and specific in a way that abstract argument could not. Here was a man. Here was a rod. Here was the man after the rod. And the difference was not in his memories or his face or his name. It was in something more fundamental, the way he was in the world. Damasio's contribution was to connect this philosophical observation to a specific scientific mechanism, the integration of emotion and reason in decision-making. The self, in his model, is not just thought. It is thought guided by feeling. When the guidance breaks down, the self becomes unrecognizable, not because intelligence is gone, but because the emotional compass that gives thought its direction and social behavior its coherence has been destroyed. We are, Damasio argued, creatures of feeling as much as creatures of thought. And the feeling is not a luxury or a distraction from the real business of the mind. It is the real business of the mind. It is what makes us, specifically and irreducibly, ourselves. At the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School, there is a display case containing 2 objects. One is a human skull. the top of the cranium clearly missing a section, the bone around the absent piece showing the irregular edges of a wound that was never surgically repaired because surgical repair, in 1848, was not something that could be done. The other is a metal rod, 3 feet 7 inches long, over an inch in diameter at one end, tapering to a point at the other, weighing 13¼ pounds. The surface of the rod, if you look closely, still carries traces of the engraving that Phineas Gage had put on it, his name, to identify the custom tool he had made to his own specifications. They have been together in that case, the skull and the rod, for over a century, studied, scanned, photographed, argued over. Two objects that together contain one of the strangest and most important stories in the history of science. The rod passed through the skull in a fraction of a second, on a September afternoon in Vermont, in 1848. In that fraction of a second, it destroyed enough of a young man's frontal lobe to change who he was, permanently, irreversibly, in ways that his closest friends recognized immediately, and that science would spend a century and a half trying to understand. It also, in passing through that skull, gave science something it did not previously have: concrete, undeniable evidence that the personality, the self, is a physical thing, that it lives somewhere specific, that it can be damaged, that it can change. This is not a comfortable idea. It sits uneasily with how most people feel about themselves, as continuous, stable selves that transcend the physical. It suggests that who we are is more contingent, more fragile, more dependent on the ongoing integrity of a few pounds of tissue than we typically like to think. But it is also, in its way, a profoundly humanizing idea, because it means that the behavior of others, their reliability, their kindness, their social grace, their capacity for moral judgment is not simply a matter of character or will. It is a matter of brain. When these things change in a brain injury patient or in a person with a neurological condition that affects the frontal lobe, the change is real. The person is different, and the difference is not a moral failing. It is a physical fact. Phineas Gage did not choose to become fitful and profane and unreliable. The rod chose it for him, in the fraction of a second it took to pass through his skull. He was 25 years old on the day the rod went through his brain. He lived for another 11 years, working, adapting, surviving in the ways that were still available to him. He died at 36, in San Francisco, far from the Vermont field where everything changed. His skull and his rod are still at Harvard. And the questions he left behind about the self, about the brain, about what makes a person the person they are still being answered. We have learned a great deal since 1848. We have not finished learning. Thank you for watching. The story of Phineas Gage is one that I think becomes more fascinating and more humanizing the more honestly you examine it, the survival, the change, the science, and the deep philosophical questions underneath all of it. If this story made you think, share it with someone. Subscribe for the next story. And leave a comment what part of Gage's story hit you hardest. The survival itself. The fact that his friends said he was no longer Gage. Or the question of what the self actually is. I want to know.